Welcome to Who's in STEM. I'm Ken Ono, your host, and the STEM advisor to the Provost and the Marvin Rosenblum Professor of Mathematics at UVA. Our goal is to evoke flights of imagination and wonder by showcasing the cornucopia of all that is STEM at UVA, the marvelous world of UVA science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now, on the podcast, we have explored some truly incredible topics. AI, artificial intelligence, everyone's talking about that. Autonomous Indy cars, chemistry, environmental science, neuroscience, physics, environmental science, and so much more. We've had some of UVA's brightest STEM stars in conversation. Now, today is special, and I'm really excited to share my absolute favorite subject. It might not be yours, but it is mine. It's mathematics. And as a passionate, pure mathematician, especially obsessed with number theory, I can't wait to dive into this world with you. And guess what? You are really going to love it, even if you're one of those folks who think that they aren't good at math or have, honestly, the wrong stereotypical image of pure mathematicians. So, in conversation today, we have an amazing guest, one of UVA's top mathematicians who's making waves in a field called Combinatorics. And I want you to get ready for a fun, lively, and mind-blowing conversation that you won't want to miss. And in fact, you probably won't forget. I'm thrilled to welcome Jennifer Morse, Professor of Mathematics at UVA. Jennifer, it's fantastic to have you on Who's in STEM.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you so much for having me.
So Jennifer, you've been invited to give an invited address at the 2026 International Congress of Mathematicians. And to get a feel for what that is, if you're in the audience, think the Olympics. You see, the Olympics are held every 4 years, and the ICM, the International Congress of Mathematicians, also is held every 4 years. At the Olympics, we give out medals for the world's top athletes. And at the ICM, they also give out medals. In fact, they only give out a few medals. Maybe 4 would be the maximum that are awarded. And these are called the Fields Medals, often called and referred to as the Nobel Prize of Mathematics. So getting an invitation to speak at the ICM is something like making the U.S. Olympic swimming team, which I think UVA fans know quite a lot about. It's a huge achievement. So Jennifer, what did it feel like to receive this honor?
Well, of course, I was very shocked, and my first reaction was terror, actually, because I'm really nervous about public speaking, and to be amongst so many brilliant mathematicians is a big deal. And
in history, it's not just the mathematicians that are speaking in 2026. By the way, the Congress will be in Philadelphia, so many of us will be there.
Yeah, definitely scary. So I have to admit that my first reaction, of course, was I felt very flattered, but also really scared. But I don't know, then I started to think about my career and about the people who I've worked with. And because I have this body of work that I've done over a long period of time with some people who I've worked with for 10 years, talking every day or every other day. And so they're really part of me, so I feel
you're sharing it with them, right?
Yeah,
and they're celebrating with you.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's really all of our achievement.
That's very generous, very kind, and that's who you are. Before we dive into the math, which we will, and other intriguing topics, I want to talk about origin stories, right? What makes science interesting is much more than just the science and the achievements and the honors. It's the people that drive the science. So in this episode, it's deeply personal for you, but as a mathematician and as a colleague in your department, it's also personal for me. So in terms of origin stories, I can say as a mathematician myself, my story is very different from yours. I'm the son of a mathematician. My dad was a professor at Johns Hopkins, and from a young age, my parents groomed me for a career in math. And to show you what that looks like, by second grade, my parents already made me take the SAT. And during the summer breaks, I spent hours doing geometry problems, Euclidean geometry, show these two lines are parallel, yada, 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 on this little tiny desk that my dad set up next to his gigantic heavy steel desk while he worked on his research problems, the one that paid the bills. In contrast, your origin story is something completely different, unexpected.
I definitely did not grow up in that environment. I grew up on a farm. The first 11 years I was in Vermont on a dairy farm, and this was a community of people who had been farming for generations. I mean, my parents are extremely intellectual in the sense that they're very curious. They read a lot. They're always thinking about things, and they have a lot of interests. So I don't exactly know what the term academic means to people, so I hesitate to say that they're not academic, because in that sense they really are. But of course, we have long days working outside and, running from geese and terrifying things like this. My job was to take care of the baby calves. Each of the kids had sort of a specific chore, and mine was always to take care of the babies, so feeding them, make sure they had water, make sure they weren't sick, and things like this. I just remember doing that as long as I have been alive, so I have no idea. As soon as I could hold a bottle, we did that. And then I also did that. We moved to Virginia to a larger farm, and there's also dairy, and I still did. That was when I remember starting school and stuff.
So what was school like? Middle school, high school?
Yeah, I don't remember. For me, school was really a social outlet, because if you grow up on a farm, right, you're not near a lot of people.
You see more calves than people.
Yes. Yeah. And so I'm very, very close to my family as a result of that. We were together all the time, except when I was in school. And so I looked forward to school in the sense that I liked to interact with people, but I don't really remember. I was not at all interested in school in terms of what we were learning. I don't remember any of that, and it just wasn't a very notable thing for me.
So you must have somehow found your way to college. Is that where you discovered a more traditional path, a career in math?
I wasn't even really that interested in going to college, frankly. My dad loved Virginia Tech because they have an amazing agricultural program, and he had taken a lot of extension classes there. When certain new technologies are introduced for farming, then he would want to learn about them. And so Virginia Tech was like this huge thing in his head, and I wasn't enthusiastic about more school. And my dad was like, I got to take you to Virginia Tech. It's a wonderful place. And so that is where I ended up going because of him. And then that was amazing. I absolutely loved it because there were just people around all the time of my age, and there were so many people that you could meet someone that you connected with. And I had never really had that. It was mostly just my family, and I really loved that. And my parents were like, you just need to find something that you love. They never pushed us to do anything in particular. They thought it was really important that we tried to find something that interested us.
Were your parents college graduates?
Yeah,
okay,
they
all
are.
right.
They both have a degree in biology, undergraduate degrees in biology. But then, they went into farming, and so I think they had the perspective, and I grew up with the idea that anything is possible. You just have to figure out which of those things you want to pursue. And so they encouraged me not to decide on anything right away. So I took like one of everything, literally one of everything. And then they said, at about year 3, they said, well, of course, you have to finish in 4 years. And I went to the advising people, and they were like, the only thing you can do is get this major we call general studies. It was basically
You didn't graduate in mathematics. You got an undergraduate degree in general studies.
Yeah, general studies. But I had focused in Spanish and English. I love reading. And
how many math classes did you take?
I had taken calculus, and then I did well, and I liked it, and so I took the calculus series in undergraduate.
That has to be like the lightest undergraduate math curriculum ever heard from a professional mathematician. That's really something amazing. So you graduated from Virginia Tech in general studies.
Yep.
What did you do with that?
I just took whatever job I could get. And that time, I went to Washington, D.C., and I was a copy editor, which made sense because I had a degree in English. And also I was able to get in through a connection with my uncle into the job. So I copy edited, which means that I had to correct grammatical errors in these journal articles. And it was a geophysical journal. I didn't know what geophysics was. I had never taken any physics. But I remember, there at the time we had no computers or anything. So they would, if the researchers had figures to include, they had to send by mail copies of their figures. And if they weren't original, we had to call them and say, like, we need your original figures. And I remember just calling one guy once, one of the authors, and I said, like, I need your original figures. That's required. And he was like, what? And I repeated like 5 times, and he said, like, I can't hear you. I'm in Antarctica, and the reception's not very good. And I was like, what? You're in Antarctica? Like, you're being paid to be in Antarctica? So then I looked more into, like, wow, if you're a geophysicist, you can go and get paid to be in Antarctica, which sounded amazing to me. And so...
Sounds cold to me.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, now maybe it wouldn't be my first choice, but at the time, like, the idea of traveling and getting paid to do it was amazing. And so I didn't really think through the fact that I had no idea about geophysics, no background in geo or physics, but I just got in the car and drove. Actually, my sister and I drove across country in this old beat-up car, and I showed up at Scripps Institute of Oceanography because that was where I noticed many of the authors were publishing were at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. So I thought, oh, that's near Mexico, and I like Spanish. I'd studied Spanish. What could be more perfect? So I just drove out there and showed up at a professor's door, knocked on the door, and he was there. And I said, okay, I want to be a geophysicist. I mean, now when I imagine a student doing this to me, I just like I don't even know if I would be able to respond politely. But this guy was extremely kind, and he said, well, you need to start by taking physics and maybe some programming. And then he said complex analysis. I have no idea why you picked these 3 things, but at UCSD it was very inexpensive to pay to take a course. So I paid, I worked on the side tutoring surfers or whatever who didn't want to go to school to make money, and I took these classes, and, well, I didn't become a geophysicist, as you see.
So you took complex analysis and some math courses in addition to other random courses, let's say, and somehow you found your way to graduate school in mathematics. So first of all, you had to complete an undergraduate math curriculum to be...
Well, no, I didn't. I did not have an undergraduate math curriculum when I went to graduate school. I took a computer graphics class. So at the time, computers were just starting out, and I had read some articles in Science News about computer vision and sounded really interesting. And the guy at Scripps had said to take a computer class. So I remember my roommate worked at the pub on campus, so I spent a lot of time there. And there was a flyer on the door of the pub for, like, computer graphics with Mathematica. And I was like, okay. So I signed up. That actually turned out to be a math class, and it was taught by Adriano Garcia.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you did computer programming in Mathematica, and I don't know, we connected. He's such a huge personality, so enthusiastic about what he does.
So for our listeners, I should say that Garcia was an iconic figure in the world of mathematics and also on the beaches of La Jolla, California. Can you for our audience, paint
Capture
a picture?
Him?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he looked like Santa Claus, and he is Italian. And every day he would do math on the beach. And he loved students and was always going to spend as much time as students asked, but he was always going to be found on, when I was there, La Jolla shores. And he would just be there. He made friends because people thought he was homeless. And because he would, like, sit there with his shopping cart filled with towels and stuff, and he would just scribble away doing math, and always available, and just such a huge personality. So he had given an assignment, which of course I did, because that's what you do in an undergraduate class. You do your assignments. But I guess he wasn't expecting us to actually be able to do it. I had no idea. So he sort of thought that I had a lot of talent mathematically, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And remember, I was paying for these classes out of my pocket. And so I went and asked him for a letter of recommendation for something, and he was like, why don't you just go to graduate school in math? And I was like, oh, I can't really afford that. I wasn't thinking about the fact that I didn't know any math. And he said, like, they pay you to do this. And said, what? He's like, yeah, they not only pay your tuition, they actually pay you a stipend. And I was like, okay, well, then I'll definitely do that because, that's my job. I wasn't thinking like I'm going to be a mathematician. I was thinking the next thing in my life will be this PhD program. Obviously, I didn't have the background. I'd had a couple of courses, and, well, Adriano didn't think that was a problem. But there was another professor when I asked because I needed 2 letters to apply. Obviously, he pulled a lot of strings to get me in because I didn't have the background. But I still needed to submit the requisite letters of recommendation. And one of the professors that I asked was like, I can write you a good letter of recommendation, but you have to pass these qualifying exams within a year or 2. And I just don't think that you'll be able to learn all the math you need to pass those quals. That's the way it works. And he was right in the sense, he didn't turn out to be right, but that was actually the right advice to give. He was being very honest, and it wasn't anything against me, and I appreciate frank advice. I chose to take the risk, but I like that I had all the knowledge about there being a risk, and then it was on me.
Yeah, so I'm sure most of the audience is quite surprised by everything that you've just described. So as an understatement, your career path is unusual. It is extraordinary. And before we dive into the math, I kind of want you to reflect on your personal journey and how it has impacted how you do your mathematics, because it is so different from anything that I actually understand in terms of personal experience.
Right. If you aren't a farmer, then you couldn't see the analogy. But if I think about like how I grew up and just my family background is very similar to being a mathematician, even though I know that doesn't seem like it. But like every single day on the farm, there are very difficult problems to solve, right? You're always thinking about new and unexpected problems. The thought that goes into farming and the challenges are very, very similar. And also the hard work. It's nonstop work. You wake up and you're thinking about farming and the things you have to do. You go to bed thinking about that. And it's very hard. Farming's very hard. Math is very hard. Anyway, there's a lot of similarities in terms of how I was raised and what qualities I need as a mathematician.
Well, speaking of the math, let's dive in. So tell us about your math. What do you study? Why do you love it?
Yeah, this is such a hard question because I'm so obsessed with it and I just love it so much. But it's very difficult to capture in a short amount of time for people that are not mathematicians what is so amazing about it. But I work in a field called algebraic combinatorics, and I expect that people don't know what that is. And when I arrived at UCSD as a graduate student, I had never heard of that either. I didn't know what combinatorics was, but I had met Garcia and he had pulled all these strings to get me in. And so I naturally was going to listen to anything he said. And he kept showing me these polynomials. He kept on thrusting.
So like x squared plus y squared.
Yeah. So most people were introduced to polynomials in middle school or high school algebra, and like the parabola would be something that you could think of as a polynomial that maps out. That's the equation that shows like if you shoot a basketball, what is the trajectory? So that's modeled with the polynomial equation. That's in one variable. Then if you went on to like calculus, you might have looked at polynomials in 2 variables. So this is going to be something like a satellite dish in 3 dimensions. But polynomials they exist in any number of variables, not just x and y, not just in 3 dimensions. So that's about all I knew when I was there as a graduate student. And he was showing me these polynomials with, variables and coefficients, numbers in front of the variables. He was like, look at these positive coefficients. So like they were these polynomials. If you were in
positive versus negative numbers, like 10 versus negative 3.
And not just positive versus negative, but whole numbers versus fractions, right? So I think most people would hope when they get a test in middle school or high school that their math teacher gives them something with whole numbers because they don't want to have to add fractions. And if they're positive, that would be even greater. as it turns out in my area, we feel the same. We want positive numbers, and I didn't know why he was so excited about that. I assumed it wasn't for the same reason I was, because it's easier to add whole numbers than fractions. But I later came to understand that positive numbers are sort of the hallmark of the area of combinatorics. So combinatorics, if you looked it up on the internet or whatever, it would say combinatorialists spend their time counting things. And I hope that the upper administration isn't going to pull our funding when they think
Yeah, they're not going to hand you a bag of apples and say,
count these.
Yeah, no, it's not like that.
No, that's right. And it turns out counting is actually extremely difficult. So first, maybe to give you a sense of what is counting, why do we care? If you think about your life, counting problems come up all the time. Like my daughter had to figure out her schedule recently. She's just in college, and so she called and was like, I need your help. I have to decide on, what schedule to have. So immediately I'm like, well, how many choices do you have? How many viable choices of schedule do you have? Because I'm wondering how much time this is going to take, right? And so she has a certain number of options that give her the required classes and give her space to do her job. So, of course, that's just like a dumb personal counting problem, but the university has that to a larger degree. They have to schedule all the professors and all the students, and they want to present a schedule that how many students are going to be able to get the requirements that they need in time to graduate. That's a counting problem, right? And they want to make sure a lot of students get what they want. And these scheduling problems come up in all corporations and are very important counting problems. Saturday night, I was with my brother-in-law, who's a winemaker here in Charlottesville, and it's harvest. So harvest is a intense time for them. And so I was asking how it was going this season, and he was saying, well, the yield is lower than we thought. And he was explaining, you need to sort of know how many grapes you're going to bring in, because then you can anticipate how much manpower you need, how many bottles you need, etc., every aspect of the operation. And that's a combinatorial problem. How many grapes do they have, right? And that sort of shows you're obviously not counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How do they count how many grapes they're going to have? And it's such an important piece of information to have. So counting problems come up in every area, in all of our lives, every single day. And combinatorics is in my mind, of course it's a vast field, but it's people who want to try to figure out methods to solve counting problems. One of the things I love about combinatorics is that these counting problems are varied. How you count those grapes really is going to have to involve looking at vines and seeing how many clusters in random spots about the field, and then sort of hoping that there's an even distribution. Very different techniques than it would be if you wanted to say, count how many ways are there for me to get from point A to point B in a city where there's blocks. Let's say it's a grid city like Philadelphia. How many ways will there be for me to take different routes from point A to point B? Those are two very different problems, and they require different techniques for their solution.
And so these polynomials that Garcia showed you on the beach,
right.
are we supposed to infer that
Yes.
the positive numbers that popped up, are they somehow counting things,
right.
and it's a model for this whole framework of the theory of counting?
Yeah, so when we count, we get positive numbers. How many grapes? 2 billion tons, whatever. How many possible schedules for my daughter? Well, 30. How many for my son? 2. You know what I mean? These are positive numbers. And so if you're doing a counting problem, you're generally going to come up with a positive number. But the polynomial example is really interesting because it's sort of the reverse. He sees positive numbers there and then says, what do those count? They must be counting something. And then this is where the creativity of the field comes in. You have to invent something such that when you count it, it gives those numbers occurring in the polynomials.
So the combinatorics is the counting part, and the algebraic and algebraic combinatorics is where the objects, the polynomials, and power series come into play.
Yes, the algebraic, and it's not just algebraic, but I sort of see algebraic combinatorics as finding combinatorial problems in physics and algebraic geometry and other areas of math. Now, these polynomials, they come up.
Do they have a name?
Yeah, McDonald polynomials were the ones he was showing me. And they are polynomials that come up. It turns out they're like wave equations of some quantum relativistic particles on a circle with pairwise interactions. Okay, I don't know what that means. It doesn't really matter, but that's where the polynomials arise. And then when you see the positive number, the combinatorialist has to figure out, like, what do those numbers mean? Because they're very significant. You aren't going to just normally get beautiful positive numbers. And so then the new techniques that are needed to figure out what these positive numbers do are developed, and then they can be used for other counting problems, which may have a more obvious application when you're like applying for a grant or something. You want to try to connect to people rather than say, I sit in the corner with my McDonald polynomials.
So Jennifer, we've talked about grapes, we've talked about scheduling problems, and we've talked a little bit about how you were introduced to the field of algebraic combinatorics. Now, I think we want to hear a little bit. I know it's intimidating for us in the audience, but what are you known for? What are you being recognized for?
So Adriano, way back then, it was in the late 90s, introduced me to these McDonald polynomials. And once I had done enough research to where he was sure I could get the PhD, he let me work on whatever I wanted. And some problems with McDonald polynomials are notoriously difficult, and they're still unsolved. And so I just sort of decided that would be fun to work on, and I was working with two people, Alain Lascaux and Luc Lapointe, and we were just staring at these polynomials, trying to figure out properties. And we discovered a new family of polynomials, and it was really surprising because there was, like, what was known about McDonald polynomials and what made them amazing was maybe there were a lot of mysteries and unsolved problems, but no one was expecting that there would be a new, what's called a basis of symmetric functions that could give you sort of a refinement of some of the problems that were there. And so whatever, we used the computer and discovered this new family of polynomials. And then in trying to prove things about them, we discovered that they're connected to problems in algebraic geometry and representation theory, other areas of math and physics, like string theory. They have these numbers called Gromov-Witten invariants. These polynomials actually give you a really nice computational way to generate these Gromov-Witten invariants. So as we explored, they're called K-Sure functions, as we explored them more and more, it turned out that they really had a fundamental role in totally unexpected areas. And so then that really opened up the research. And so for the last 25 years, I've had enough to keep me employed just thinking about those.
So I guess as an analogy, it would be something like this. The engineers who first discovered the idea of gears in mechanical systems came up with an idea that might have just seemed like a simple variation of the ordinary wheel, but is now ubiquitous in machinery. So you're responsible for doing something like that, developing a theory of gears that can be deployed.
I personally think of my work as the gears, but I know full well that I have a very biased and overinflated idea of their worth. But the K-Sure functions are the gear of my life, let's say.
So, Jennifer, there's a lot that we want to talk about. Time is limited, but I would be remiss if we didn't go into this. You are, my image of what it means to be both good and great as a UVA professor in the arts and sciences. You teach a course in the engagements program. The course is called Uncommon Sense. You advise graduate students who go on to do great things. You've advised undergraduates in research. Tell us about your teaching.
I actually love teaching because students are so funny. It's fun to teach them and it's fun to hear their opinions. But anyway, at least what my perception of the engagements program is that it is requirement for all freshmen to take classes that are not necessarily in their major, if they have a major. And this is a way to expose students to something that they might not know about or might not know they liked, taught by a professor who knows a lot about that topic. The professors, I think, are intended to bring their subject matter into a more accessible and also broader context, right? Like I work on K-Sure functions. I dig a very, very, very narrow tunnel down to the center of the earth on K-Sure functions, and no student in their right mind has any idea what that is. And it's the opposite of that, I think. And so first I was attracted to teaching it because, as you heard, I was not a math major and I didn't know what I wanted to be. And now I'm a research mathematician. And I feel like this is a possibility for anybody. And I think very young, the kids are asked to decide what they want to do. It's expected on their college applications to have some sort of agenda for their lives. And I just think that they may miss out on something that they didn't even know about. Obviously, this comes from my own personal experience. But anyway, so I liked this idea of teaching to students who weren't necessarily math majors. And I also had read Ellenberg's amazing book, How Not to Be Wrong, where he talks about sort of basic mathematical ideas that can frame how we see things in the right or wrong way. And it's a hilarious book, and I love that. And so I just decided that it would be fun to teach a class where we sort of see firsthand through activities how our first instincts, without thinking through them, could really lead us astray in medical choices, career choices, personal choices, political choices. And so we just do like lots of fun activities that expose, and then I focus on math, obviously, because that's such a wonderful way, easy way to show people like, look, you thought that, but mathematically that's like not at all what's going on. And that happens to all of us. So we do a lot of activities sort of based on having a gut reaction that can change with a small amount of thought and interaction with people with different ideas and stuff like this.
Well, thank you. We do have to begin wrapping up here. Just very quickly, a piece of advice for students who might be listening. What advice would you give an incoming freshman or an undergraduate student seeking to find their way at a time when so much in the world seems uncertain?
It's funny because I have an undergraduate student who's awesome, and he's had several classes with me, and I give advice all the time, and I like him because he always points out how ridiculous my advice can be. So I want to start by saying that my advice is very personally based on my own experiences. But I think like that I would say there are so many options for you, and you're very young and things can change and you can change, and it's okay to make a choice now and change it later. But you really want to try to find something that you enjoy doing because, and I mean, that's a privilege, of course. If you're able to find something that you enjoy and make a living out of it, you're very lucky. But that, I think, should be the aim, and is for several reasons. One, because then you'll be happy while you do your work. But two, because you'll automatically get this work-life balance that everybody talks about. On one hand, you can think, what's a work-life balance? I have my work, and then I need to balance it with the things I like. But if you already like your work, you already have the balance. And so that's how it was with my parents in farming. That's how it is with me in math. We work all the time. And you could say there's no balance. I mean, I do have my 2 kids, of course. But there's very little balance. It's a huge amount of work. But since I love it, that's not even a question for me.
Well, Jennifer, our time is up. This was wonderful. It's been wonderful to have you on. Thank you for your contributions to mathematics, to farming back in the day, and, of course, to the University of Virginia. I'm Ken Ono, STEM advisor to the Provost and the Marvin Rosenblum Professor of Mathematics, and you've been listening to Who's in STEM.
Who's in STEM is a production of WTJU 91.1 FM and the Office of the Provost at the University of Virginia. Who's in STEM is produced by Benjamin Larson, Katie Nichols, and Ria Verma. Our music is composed and performed by Robert Schneider and John Ferguson of Apples and Stereo. Follow us on Instagram, listen and subscribe to Who's in STEM on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back soon with another conversation about scientific and technological innovation at the university.